In 1944, during the height of World War II, an event occurred that would later remain forever etched in the memories of those who heard about it. In August of that year, in the area of Kanchanaburi, on the border between Thailand and Burma, an unusual person appeared, a ghost who suddenly materialized out of nowhere. This individual, barefoot, with skin stretched tightly over his bones, and empty eyes as if devoid of peace and rest, unexpectedly stepped onto the line of contact between Allied forces. He slowly, unsteadily, caught the attention of the guards, and his appearance made a strong impression. He spoke English confidently, claiming to serve in the United States Navy, and mentioned the USS Houston. At first, the guards perceived his words as a joke or some strange madness. No one laughed, but no one fully believed him either. Still, an inner voice suggested that this man was saying something very important, even if he seemed utterly devoid of common sense. The official version stated that the USS Houston had been destroyed in the Sunda Strait 3 years earlier, as a result of an attack by Japanese artillery. All its crew had perished, and there was no further news about it. But this stranger, as if by some sinister coincidence, began to tell an incredible story. He spoke of 2 cruisers that suddenly attacked an entire Japanese naval squadron, of how Japanese transports burst into flames in the darkness, and of a Japanese commander thrown into burning water. His story sounded like nonsense, complete madness, yet he named details that no outsider could have known. Gradually, as if slicing into some hidden secret, his absurd words revealed a very humiliating secret that the Japanese had desperately tried to hide, drowning it in the depths of the sea. The date of this incredible event was February 28, 1942. The location, the island of Java. At that time, this territory represented the last stronghold of Allied forces in the Eastern Indies. Everything was on the brink of collapse. 2 weeks had passed since the fall of Singapore, which was considered an impregnable fortress protecting the southern borders of the British Empire. But on February 14th, the Japanese stormed and captured it, taking about 85,000 soldiers prisoner and destroying any hope of stopping the Japanese advance. At that moment, the command under Lord Wavell, representing a multinational alliance of forces, began to disintegrate like sugar dissolving in water. The British, Americans, Dutch, and Australians who remained alive lost all organization and even stopped trying to mount a coordinated defense. The Japanese, meanwhile, were implementing a dangerous and deadly strategy, a powerful encirclement ring. From the east and west, Japanese squadrons, like bloody tentacles slicing through tropical waters, moved toward Java. Part 2 of 11. Their fleet consisted of aircraft carriers, battleships, heavy cruisers, and dozens of destroyers that escorted transports overloaded with combat veterans. The entire Japanese fleet, the might of the Imperial Navy, ruthlessly dealt with any Allied forces that dared to oppose it. In the harbor of Batavia, on the shore, 2 worn-out cruisers prepared for the impossible, their final battle. These ships remained the only large combat vessels of the Allied forces still capable of staying afloat in this fight. Among them were the USS Houston and HMAS Perth, the last large Allied warships remaining alive in the Java Sea. USS Houston was in terrible condition. Its turret number 3, the most important for firing, was immobile, with a damaged turret structure, and only the crew inside remained. Waller carefully studied maps together with the navigator from Perth, concentrating on the strategic situation in the Sunda Strait. This narrow, winding strait, located between the islands of Java and Sumatra, was only 60 nautical miles wide. At first glance, it seemed like a fairly narrow passage, but in reality, its width could be half or even a third less, since in naval matters, even a small width could become a serious obstacle. An important feature of this strait was that Japanese submarines constantly monitored all movements in the area. Also, at dawn, patrol planes took to the air to control the situation and prevent unexpected attacks. However, despite all precautions, Dutch intelligence reported that, at that moment, the Sunda Strait was open, unblocked, and ready for passage. This gave hope. It was possible to go through in the darkness of night, refuel at the Cilacap base, and then quickly move toward Australia, justifying the chance to escape from the difficult situation. The ship captains had only one chance for success. They had to pass through a very narrow and dangerous corridor, overcome any patrolling forces, and leave before the Japanese fleet completely subdued Java. It was all there. Risk, bravery, and hope for luck. But what Waller did not know, and all the commanders of the Allied forces knew this, was that the Japanese Western Offensive Fleet had already arrived here at this very moment. On board the 65 transports nearby, the landing of the 16th Army was underway. These ships formed a vast army stretching far beyond the horizon, like a long living ribbon. All this powerful fleet operated very efficiently, and their goal was to land troops as quickly as possible. Nearby, along the coastline, 4 heavy cruisers from Division 7 patrolled: Kumano, Suzuya, Mogami, and Mikuma. These ships were impressive, each weighing over 13,000 tons. Their powerful 18-inch guns could pierce armor at 20,000 yards, making them dangerous opponents even for the sturdiest ships. In the distance across the sea, the aircraft carrier line was struck. Among them was the Ryujo aircraft carrier, whose planes were ready at any moment to attack any enemy ships showing weakness or making a mistake. In addition to these formidable forces, the fleet included 3 light cruisers and 10 destroyers. All of this formed an impressive and well-trained combat unit, but despite their power, the main threats were invisible to the eye. Each Japanese vessel was equipped with standard long-lance torpedoes, or as they called them, Ryujo, capable of reaching speeds of up to 49 knots and traveling 20,000 yards. These torpedoes outperformed all existing Allies' counterparts. In night battles, they became true weapons of destruction, as Japanese crews were well-trained in darkness, honing their tactics and skills. As a result, the Japanese fleet now fully controlled the sea off the western coast, where they recently sank the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, destroyed the British ships Prince of Wales and Repulse off the coast of Malaya, and yesterday completely defeated the combined American, British, Dutch, Australian squadron in the Java Sea. The Allies were reduced to a few destroyed destroyers and perhaps 1 or 2 damaged cruisers, which no longer posed a threat to the main Japanese forces. But despite their numerical superiority, some commanders of the Allied forces showed the ship crews worked hurriedly and under tension, understanding how vulnerable and dangerous their situation was at that moment. Everything was prepared for a possible attack, and the ships were in a particularly vulnerable state. They were anchored, unprotected, with open cargo holds containing numerous soldiers and equipment. All their hope and safety depended on the enemy not making a sudden appearance among the transports. Even a single enemy cruiser torpedo boat emerging suddenly from the darkness among these ships could lead to catastrophe. However, the Japanese command completely dismissed such fears. Their intelligence reported that the last large Allied ships had already retreated eastward, fleeing pursuit. Admiral Dorman's fleet had been destroyed, and Singapore had fallen. Everything seemed to indicate that the enemy had gained the upper hand. But despite all these reports, the enemy was already defeated, scattered across the sea, and completely demoralized. No one dared to attack such a powerful and overwhelming force that seemed invincible. At 10:50 in the evening, something unusual was noticed aboard the Fubuki. Vigilant observers spotted 2 silhouettes moving in the darkness. These objects were enormous, and they moved without lights, approaching from the direction of Batavia. The destroyer captain examined them carefully through binoculars. It was obviously military ships. But whose exactly? Their outlines seemed familiar. One appeared larger than the other. They were approaching quickly, purposefully, and with determination. Fubuki turned toward them to pursue these objects, her old engines strained and working hard to keep up. The radio operator prepared to send a distress signal. 2 unidentified vessels entering the bay. The sense of impending trouble began to grow even before the ships left port. An odd incident occurred in the Perth ship's wardroom. A portrait of the Duchess of Kent, who had blessed this ship in 1939, suddenly fell to the floor. The glass shattered, scattering shards across the space. The sailors exchanged worried glances. It was a bad omen, a harbinger of misfortune. At the same time, their faithful fuzzy mascot, an orange cat named Red Ice, tried 3 times to leave the ship in Batavia port. Each time the sailors, frightened, returned him back, scolding and cursing. He seemed to understand that something bad was happening and most likely sensed the approaching trouble. Something strange was happening aboard the Houston. There served a Chinese cook called Buddha who behaved unusually all day. Usually cheerful and lively, he now seemed like a ghost, moving quietly and passively around the kitchen, almost like a shadow. When asked what was wrong, he only shook his head and returned to his duties, unwilling to explain anything. At 6:30 p.m., both ships left the port. Captain Waller transmitted a command via radio. "We are heading to Cilacap through the Sunda Strait. Aerial reconnaissance shows the strait is clear of enemy ships. However, there is a report of a large enemy convoy group approximately 50 miles northeast of Batavia, moving eastward." They were moving away from danger, with about 50 miles of open sea between them and the enemy. It seemed reliable, and the tired crews, hopeful, looked forward to a safe outcome. The sailors of the Houston went about their tasks. The ship lay on the deck. Then he turned to the officer of the watch with a short command. "Push me if anything happens." After that, he took the pipe from his mouth and instantly fell asleep. It was hard over heck. A man as calm as ice, even when everyone else was literally sweating and nervous. His calmness seemed to radiate through the ship's bridge, creating the impression that everything was under control. If this old man could sleep peacefully, perhaps they still had a chance, and they might get through this dangerous night. The ships cut through the dark water like sharp blades, while each person on board carefully watched the horizon. At 10:50 p.m., they approached Bantam Bay. 5 miles ahead was Cape St. Nicholas, the gateway to the Sunda Strait and possibly a route to freedom. At 11:59 in the evening, the lookout from Perth reported via radio, "Ship, sir, course is green, 5 degrees." At that moment, Waller instantly stood up before the message could be completed. A silhouette emerged from the darkness. It was a destroyer slicing through the water directly toward them. For a fraction of a second, Waller hoped it might be a Dutch or American ship. But the response came quickly. The destroyer answered the call with green lights showing 2 signals. That meant it was a Japanese destroyer. Waller ordered over the radio, "Alarm bells! Ring the alarm bells! Open fire from the forward guns!" The alarm bells rang throughout the ship. The bells clanged, and a rapid, coordinated panic ensued. 682 men rushed to their battle stations, ready for combat. Waller remained on the bridge, motionless as a rock, with his pipe clenched between his teeth, watching as the destroyer turned and withdrew, spewing smoke and leaving a trail of black clouds behind. But then his gaze stopped. He saw them, many ships, everywhere, dark silhouettes against the moonlight, like shadows hiding in the night. There were 10, 20, or perhaps more. The entire Bantam Bay seemed shrouded in a steel carpet. Transports, cruisers, destroyers. This formidable enemy fleet. Someone whispered, "They've surrounded us on all sides." At that moment, Waller faced a choice. Either turn back into the trap of the Java Sea, where new Japanese ships were already waiting, or try to break through this mighty fleet and reach the Sunda Strait. There was simply no other option. In his mind, the command sounded, "Full speed ahead. We're going straight through this. Lead as a wolf." And the ship erupted in flames, as if a raging storm had been unleashed. The thunder of Perth's guns echoed through the night. The Houston followed, her remaining operational turrets turned toward the enemy, trying to find a target. Star rockets exploded in the sky, transforming the night into a hellish naval spectacle. In this grim light, it became clear they had literally fallen into the heart of the Japanese offensive force. There were many ships here, hundreds of guns ready to fire at any second. Waller ordered his gunners, "Choose your targets." While Captain Houston was supposed to coordinate the heavy guns through the central control, Waller gave his men what was most important to them: the freedom to fight as they saw fit, to make decisions independently. Perth became a cogwheel of fire. She was scattering shells in all directions like a chainsaw. Waller maneuvered the ship as if he were a driver, skillfully weaving between torpedo salvos, evading gunfire, and, when it seemed the danger was passing, turning to face the threat again. It was around 11:49 p.m. when the first torpedo strike hit the ship. The explosion was so powerful that it seemed as if the earth itself trembled beneath them, and Perth itself seemed to rise from the water and soar into the air. Part 6 of 11. A wave of fire surged upward, scattering shards and sparks across the deck. Inside the ship, people began flying through the compartments as if they were balls in a furious game. In the forward engine room, an explosion tore through the steam lines, and hot steam heated to 500 degrees filled the space, transforming it into a steaming lava flow. The vessel started to list, losing speed and control. It soon became clear that the enemy was not going to stop. Torpedoes continued to fly, and shells burst all around, forcing the crew to fight for every second of their lives. The Japanese found the range and the point from which they could hit the target. At that moment, Captain Waller understood clearly. His ship was doomed. But perhaps there was still a chance to give the Houston an opportunity to escape and survive. He looked at his men, those who had followed him through all the trials, whom he trusted unconditionally, and he uttered his final words: "Leave the ship." On the deck of the Perth, a real storm was raging. Not a natural one, but a combat storm. Teams armed with training bricks, solid, heavy, and without explosives, desperately began shoving them into gun barrels. These bricks could not harm the enemy, but they were the only weapons the crew had to resist in some way. When the bricks ran out, they started loading sea flare rockets, star shells to illuminate the darkness. And when even those were gone, someone from the combat crew shouted, "Use everything you have." At that moment, one of the sailors noticed wooden boxes of potatoes. It seemed absurd, a crazy idea that, nonetheless, could distract the enemy at least a little. But even in such a hopeless situation, the Perth's guns kept firing, pouring everything they could lay hands on toward the circling Japanese cruisers. Bricks, planks, pieces of metal. The attack by Japanese destroyers was carried out in groups of 3 ships, acting like a pack of predatory animals. They quickly approached, launched torpedoes, and immediately turned to run. From another side, new enemy ships appeared to continue the barrage. The Houston's turrets spun, trying to skillfully fire at targets emerging from all sides. Their mechanisms creaked and squealed, and the guns worked non-stop, attempting to capture and destroy enemies from any direction. The ship's war journal recorded these terrible events with conciseness. The fight turned into something like a melee, a furious battle with no time for precise aiming. The distance was no more than 5,000 yards, almost at arm's length for naval combat. And then the Japanese made a fateful mistake. At 11:57 in the evening, the heavy cruiser Mogami fired 6 long lance torpedoes at 10,000 yards. But none of these shells hit their target. They missed and, as if blinded, flew straight into their own ships. One torpedo struck the transport Rujo Maru, the flagship of Commander Inamura. It exploded right in the middle. The blast threw the commander and his staff into the air. Other torpedoes hit their targets. Japanese transport ships burst into flames, while tanks and trucks, submerged in water, began to sink. Soldiers trapped in the darkness screamed in horror, drowning in the water. Time seemed to stand still as shrapnel tore through his body. Lieutenant Smith tightly held the captain in his arms, trying to stop the bleeding that quickly filled the deck with blood. The entire deck was flooded with a crimson liquid that slowly spread across the wooden planks, forming a bloody sea. Rux's body disappeared into the chaos of the battle. He could no longer be found amid this bloody madness. Soon, Chinese cook Buddha, known as Boda, approached them and found them. He carefully lifted Rux's body, pressed it to his chest, and began to gently rock back and forth, as if trying to comfort his soul, or at least ease his suffering. Seeing this, the officers tried to persuade Boda to leave Rux and go to a safe place to escape. But he simply and firmly replied, quote, "The captain is dead, Houston is dead, Boda will also die." He did not release Rux's body until he felt the danger was close. Then he let go and stepped aside. Time passed, and after a while, Boda was forced to abandon his position because the threat was becoming unbearable. At the same time, in the darkness, the ship approaching them at sea, the Perseus, began its final battle. At midnight, precisely at 12:25 a.m. on March the 1st, it turned upside down. Its battle standard, the Australian flag, still fluttered in the wind as the vessel quietly sank beneath the water. The surrounding water and debris scattered around seemed to turn it into a grave filled with oil and trash that covered everything around. Only 8 minutes passed, and Houston also disappeared. Japanese searchlights brightly illuminated her as she slowly sank downward, growing ever lower. Mechanical machine guns fired at her decks as if trying to halt the ship's final moments of life. But something astonishing happened. Suddenly, the wind blew and raised the Japanese flags fluttering on Houston. They stretched taut, as if in defiance. The American national flag fluttered in the wind, evoking a sense of resistance despite the ship beginning its final descent. Lieutenant Winslow in the water watched this moment. He saw the ship slowly vanish into the depths, and in his memory he said, quote, "With fatigue, with trembling, she slipped beneath the water, disappearing forever." Two proud ships vanished, but along with them, half of the entire invasion squadron was lost. In the water, 800 men fought in oily waters covered with fuel. Oil covered everything around, clogging noses, hindering breathing, closing eyes and turning the survivors into black ghosts, barely resembling humans. Japanese searchlights, like predator eyes, closely watched every movement, illuminating them in the darkness. And suddenly, explosions began. Torpedoes remaining from the battle continued to explode, striking the burning ships. Each blast sent powerful waves through the water, shaking it and creating tsunamis of shattered debris. Those nearby the explosions vanished instantly. Their bodies simply disappeared into the turbulent water. Among them was the chief boatswain of the Houston, Otto Schwartz. He had survived 15 hours at sea when he heard the sound of engines. Suddenly, a Japanese torpedo boat passed through the water and machine gun fire erupted from it. Shouts and groans were drowned out by the noise, and many people nearby disappeared forever. They were simply killed right in the water. The enemy boat was heading straight for Schwartz. He uttered a brief prayer, carefully removed his life vest, and without looking back, dove into the dark water. The water became his only protection, as the additional buoyancy saved not only himself, but also the other men on his raft. He felt his strength gradually waning, but continued to fight the waves, hoping for the best. Soon after, Rentz disappeared without a trace. No one saw him again. The strangest survivor was General Inamura, the commander of the offensive group involved in the naval operation. He spent about 20 minutes clinging to the wreckage of a ship or floating debris, hoping someone would come to his aid. Only after this time did he notice a boat passing nearby. Exhausted, soaked to the skin, he collapsed on the shore of Bantam Island, exhausted but alive. His assistant tried to lighten the tense atmosphere and said, "Congratulations on the successful landing, sir." It was his way of easing the tense atmosphere. Soon, a naval officer approached the scene to apologize for the friendly fire incident, but he was quickly stopped by Inamura's men. They decided it was better to take credit for the success themselves, and the general didn't need to know the details. This was decided to maintain calm and avoid unnecessary questions. The day was slowly breaking. On the ocean surface lay corpses and spilled petroleum, traces of battle and tragedy. Out of more than 1,743 people aboard the ships Houston and Perth, only 696 remained alive. The rest disappeared without a trace. Their bodies were not found, distress signals were not received, and none of the survivors could report their location. As a result, two more warships, Houston and Perth, vanished into the open ocean, as if swallowed by the bottomless night of the Pacific. In headquarters in Washington and Canberra, military personnel updated maps and lists. The ships Houston and Perth were listed as missing, along with all their crews. There were no distress signals or messages from survivors, only dark, silent emptiness. And yet these ships disappeared as if dissolved into the vast depths of the ocean, leaving behind only sad memories and unfulfilled promises. Worldwide and national services received telegrams prepared with military precision and cold formality. The Department of the Navy regrets to inform you. This was the standard message about a disappearance, offering neither a final answer nor hope for rescue. The phrase "missing in action" became a symbol of despair in the harsh reality of war. It promised neither return nor comfort nor clarity. When a mother received such a telegram, she would hang a gold star in her window, signifying that her son was missing and his fate unknown. Wives remained widows, unaware of what had happened to their husbands, as their bodies were never recovered. Children were left with only old photographs of their fathers. the only memories of those who would never return. In Houston, Texas, people could not contain their anger and pain. A wave of protests and demands for revenge erupted. The city launched a large-scale campaign to recruit volunteers and draftees, which resembled more of a religious ritual. Revenge for Houston became a battle cry. A giant 80-foot, 52 meters, replica of a cruiser was erected in the central square, symbolizing their determination. On Memorial Day, 1,400 men took the oath of allegiance. After survivors fell into the hands of the Japanese prison system, their fates were forever intertwined with a network of camps stretching from Java to Burma and even to Japan itself. These camps became symbols of suffering, pain, and death, forever etched in memory as places where human life was worth very little. Among them were notorious sites such as Changi, the prison camp in Singapore, bicycle camp, camps in Burma, and of course the famous Burmese Railway. The names of these places are forever associated with words that evoke horror, hunger, disease, death. They work there not by their own will, but under orders from the Japanese authorities, building a railway through the dense tropical forests of Thailand. The construction of this railway was one of the most brutal and bloody enterprises of the war. For every plank or stone laid, one person died. Each new segment of the railway meant the death of another prisoner. These people labored in the mines of Japanese coal pits and on shipyards where warships and vessels were built. They subsisted on rice filled with maggots, vegetables stolen from guards' gardens, and occasionally rats caught and eaten. Their bodies suffered from trophic ulcers and dysentery, turning even the strongest men into emaciated skeletons. The outside world knew nothing of what was happening inside these camps. The Japanese did not publish information about survivors from the sunken cruisers. International organizations such as the Red Cross also had no records of the fate of the missing ships and their crews. For 3.5 years, men from Houston and Perth disappeared as if erased by the ocean itself. In their homeland, many families could not believe the official version that their loved ones had died or gone missing. Mrs. Edith Rux, the widow of the ship's captain, wrote numerous letters to the Naval Department demanding the truth. Other wives formed support groups, shared rumors and hopes, exchanged news, trying to maintain a connection to reality. The mother of one of the sailors from Texas insisted she felt her son was alive. A wife from Sydney left a seat for her husband at the table every night, hoping he would return. All of them were right in their hope, for faith in the return of loved ones is the only thing that helps survive such difficult times. But each day, the list of those found alive grew shorter and shorter. On the hottest day, when the heat reached its peak, a solitary figure appeared on the front lines in Thailand, covered in torn rags and in a state of extreme exhaustion. He slowly, with difficulty, made his way to the Allied lines and declared that he was one of the survivors from the USS Houston, which had been sunk 3 years earlier with its crew. At first, the scouts and officers did not believe him. They thought it impossible. After all his comrades should have perished. But when he began naming his fellow sailors, describing the battle in detail, and recounting details never acknowledged by Japanese propaganda, their doubts disappeared. This man told them that the Houston and its companion, Perth, had not just been sunk, they had inflicted defeat on the Japanese fleet, destroying part of their invading forces, which was a real blow to the enemy. News of his return spread instantly across the front and sparked a wave of surprise and joy in the rear. These fighters, trapped in hopeless situations, did not give up and continued fighting despite a shortage of ammunition. They fought even with empty magazines, dealing painful wounds to the enemy. Soon it became clear that, despite heavy losses, these sailors did not just fight, they did everything possible to make the enemy suffer losses and feel their strength. Reports from naval observers indicated that the ships remained almost intact, maintaining an upright position on the water, their guns still aimed forward as if challenging the enemy with their fearless appearance. These combat vessels, despite everything, held their battle stance, as if demonstrating their resolve and resilience. But the truly significant monument to that tragic night is not so much the condition of the ships, but the lesson it left for all of us. That night, when two battered and worn ships faced a massive enemy offensive formation, the commanders had no illusions. They understood perfectly well that their chances were almost non-existent. Circumstances dictated that they should simply retreat, evade, and save their lives. No one would have been charged for such an action. Their superiority in forces was 10 to 1, their ammunition was running low, fatigue was taking its toll on everyone, and the prospect of total destruction seemed inevitable. However, Captain Hector Valor made a different decision. He chose to go to the very end. He opted for resilience and heroism. At the moment his ship was sinking beneath the waves, Valor stood at the helm, gripping the railing tightly, watching as his guns fell silent, surrendering to death. His body was never found, but his memory and his act of bravery remained forever in the hearts of all naval officers. Since then, when historians try to understand why the Allies won the Pacific War, they primarily point to superiority in production, technological achievements, and the ability to crack enemy codes. All of this is undoubtedly important and plays a significant role. But true victories are also built on moments when tired, exhausted people choose to fight rather than run. In those moments, despite the impossibility of success, they continue to stand. Then duty becomes more important than survival. It is these heroic acts that create the historical difference, transforming ordinary people into true heroes.